One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The treasurer.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that takes big economic issues and puts them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're bringing you a conversation from our popular webinar series. This week we're talking with Michele O'Neil, the President of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and Greg Jericho, the Labour Market and Fiscal Policy Director at the Australia Institute's Centre for Future Work. And they were talking together about the failure of successive governments in fixing low wages growth and what could be done in the upcoming budget to help turn wage stagnation around. This was recorded live on Tuesday the 15th of March 2022, and things may have changed since recording.
Thanks very much, Ebony, and thanks for everyone joining us today. I also want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands we're meeting on today. I'm here in the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay all my respects to elders past and present. It always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. And thank you to the Australia Institute for hosting this event and for all the work you do, in particular for your work in providing an economic analysis that informs and advocates for a fairer Australia. In 2 weeks' time, the federal government will hand down the 2022 budget. It will be Josh Frydenberg's third budget and this government's ninth. The annual speech that accompanies the numbers is an incredibly important part of a government's narrative. The numbers don't speak for themselves. There's always a story that moulds the numbers to create the political narrative. For Liberal Party governments, the Treasurer's story is absolutely essential to constructing the notion that they are upholding their commitments to the Australian people because they are good economic managers. And no matter what the numbers actually say, the government's script every budget night will repeat this claim. This is the government's true long-term investment, the story that only they can be trusted with the economy. That story has had incredible political power with real political outcomes that have hurt millions of Australians. Let's revisit for a moment the first LNP budget of this government by then Treasurer Joe Hockey. In his storytelling, he created two enemies, government spending and those people he called the leaners. To counter these enemies, this government's first budget cut funding to our health system, cut funding to education, including 20% cut to higher education, cut the social safety net for the unemployed, the sick, students, pensioners and low-income families. They sacked 16,500 federal public sector workers. And we must not forget who Joe Hockey was speaking about when he demonised the so-called leaners, the majority of everyday Australians, the public sector, essential and frontline workers, people on production lines, services and hospitality workers, all leaners, low-income families, the unemployed, the sick, those with disabilities, pensioners, all leaners. The government's self-nominating good economic management has hurt all these people, as if hurting people and workers is good for the economy. The pandemic revealed that this rhetoric's not only empty and harmful, but extremely poor economic management. As Jim Stanford from the Australian Institute's own Centre for Future Work has so eloquently written, the pandemic showed the Australian public who really delivers value in the economy. And it's not the smart decisions of CEOs or politicians creating investor confidence. It's people, it's workers. As our nation was put into lockdown to cope with the public health emergency, who kept us going and who stayed at work to keep us safe? Government workers, essential frontline and retail staff. Workers kept our economy going and workers deliver real value. The pandemic also showed us economic management that works for the people and the nation. Not even this LNP government could resist the actual solutions to the economic crisis wrought by the pandemic and demanded by nearly everyone. Solutions like direct support for jobs, wages and leave entitlements through hard times to keep money flowing in the economy and keep people safe. And for the recovery, if we want a recovery for all and not just for some, it's very clear that government-led interventions and investments are essential. There's another inconvenient number at the heart of every budget this government has delivered that puts a hole in their claim to be trusted on economic management. From Joe Hockey to Josh Frydenberg, from Tony Abbott to Scott Morrison, every single budget has predicted that wage growth is just around the corner. And every year under this government, Australians have instead suffered record low wage growth. After 9 years of coalition rule, Australian wages are way too low, and the problem is getting worse. The government and their decisions have baked low wage growth into Australia's economy. To use language made famous by Matthias Cormann, the finance minister at the time, to describe their design, low wages is a design feature of the labour market. Whether times are good or times are bad, whether unemployment is low or unemployment is high, wages have been growing too slowly. Wages are too low for Australian households to achieve a decent, stable standard of living. They are too low to support the consumer spending we need to continue recovering from the recession. And now they are way too low to keep up with accelerating inflation. They have suppressed wages in the public sector. Every year, they've failed to support improvements in the minimum wage. They've demonised workers and their unions trying to bargain for better wages. They've changed the laws so that casualising the workforce is easier for employers, and they've stripped away rights for workers. This is the context we must judge Josh Frydenberg's third budget on. In 2021, workers suffered the biggest pay cut in real terms that we've seen in over 20 years. As inflation has outstripped wages growth, a worker on the average income of $68,000 has effectively had an $832 pay cut. $832 pay cut. That's the average. But shockingly, it's actually worse for the workers who've been on the front line keeping the country going through the pandemic. Full-time workers in healthcare and social support have had their pay effectively cut by $967 last year. For those in transport, postal and warehousing, risking their health and safety to keep the nation running, they lost an eye-watering $1,497. Education and training workers lost $1,362, and admin and support services went backwards by $1,185. Peer beneath the inflation figures, and there's a similar story of extreme price rises hurting those who can least afford them. Petrol is grabbing the headlines, but family budgets are being hit from all sides. Childcare costs went up 6.5% last year, rising nearly 3 times faster than wages. And it's risen by even more than that in 7 out of the past 10 years. Rents are even worse, surging 9% last year, with experts predicting they'll go even higher this year. The cost of groceries is also outpacing sluggish wage growth. We've had nearly a decade of record low wage growth and nearly a decade of this coalition government. That's no coincidence. This is an Australian problem, not a global problem. Until 2013, wages in Australia were growing faster than the average in other industrial countries. Since then, they've almost ground to a halt, growing less than 1/3 as fast in real terms as the OECD average. The government has cheered on cuts to penalty rates. They walked away from their own laws to tackle wage theft. They don't support increases to the minimum wage, and they are not supporting aged care workers in their current fight for better wages. They've heavily capped the pay of their own workforce, the Commonwealth Public Service, and they've made it easier for employers to casualise staff. Insecure work is at the heart of this problem. To understand why, let's take a deeper dive into what's going on in Australian workplaces. The official unemployment rate of 4.2% is good news on the face of it. However, unemployment has mostly declined because of the impact of stimulus spending during the pandemic, combined with lower labour supply resulting from our closed borders. Morrison originally opposed JobKeeper, but unions fought for and won it. That program, combined with the coronavirus supplement and other income supports, was vital in preventing a much worse recession. However, the government did not attach adequate conditions to those programs to stop rorts and eliminated them far too soon. And even this encouraging unemployment rate is a poor measure for telling us what's really going on in the world of work. Firstly, in January, we still had close to 1 million people who wanted more hours but couldn't get them. This is supposedly at the height of employers being desperate for more workers in some sectors. Secondly, there are nearly another 1 million people marginally attached to the labour force. That means they're able to work, but were discouraged from looking the day they answered the survey. Thirdly, during Omicron, record numbers of people were officially employed, but were unable to work, either through illness, looking after others, or being forced to isolate. We estimate that 350,000 workers couldn't work at all, and a further 150,000 had to cut back on hours in January. 160 million hours of work were lost. A huge hit to workers' pay packets, all because of a let-it-rip attitude to the virus led by the federal government. Add all this together and nearly 3 million Australians either couldn't work or weren't getting enough hours. Another 2.4 million workers are casual with no right to get a shift tomorrow. Millions more are on labour hire, fixed term or sham contracting arrangements, minimum hours part-time contracts, are gig workers or suffering under other corporate strategies to cut their wages. Qantas is currently threatening their flight attendants with a staggering $27,000 pay cut by seeking to terminate their enterprise agreement. We also learned last week that a record number of Australians, 867,000, are now forced to work more than one job just to make ends meet. If you are one of these people, bargaining for a pay increase is difficult when your boss can so easily cut your hours or conditions. It's even harder if you're a woman. You're more likely to be in insecure work. You'll be paid $483.30 a week on average, less than a man, and you will receive little support to deal with your unequal share of caring responsibilities. We have some of the highest childcare costs in the developed world and the second worst paid parental leave scheme in the OECD. We won't solve our wage crisis in this country without solving our insecure work crisis. And the only thing Scott Morrison has done is to make it worse. Last year, his government passed laws making it far easier for an employer to call someone a casual, regardless of their actual working relationship. So apart from his own and the Prime Minister's, whose job will be front of mind for Josh Frydenberg as he does the numbers for his third budget? There'll be two key things we'll be watching for on budget night. Firstly, who will this budget deliver for? Frances is a 54-year-old part-time worker in an aged care centre in Brisbane. She loves her job, but she only makes $21.90 an hour and lives week to week. She's often scared about how she'll pay her bills, earning only about $550 a week. She can't even afford to buy a new work uniform that she needs. Her pay has only gone up 80 cents an hour since she first started working at the centre almost 5 years ago, while the cost of living has significantly increased. She's only been able to save about $80,000 in super, so is terrified about retirement. Her aged care centre is understaffed in every area, often leaving her to do work with aged care residents, like dressing them, helping them to be mobile around the centre, that she's not qualified and certainly not paid for. Many of her colleagues, nearly all women, have left the centre because of burnout and insecure hours and wages. Frances wishes she could be full-time, but her employer continues to cut costs and use labour hire or just not roster on enough staff. She's never taken the 2 breaks she's entitled to on a shift because there just aren't enough staff. What will Frydenberg's budget deliver for Frances? Or is she just one of the Liberal Party leaners? Secondly, we must be all on alert for the budget fudges. If the Morrison government lives up to expectations, this budget won't be about backing workers like Frances, but will be aimed at buying votes and cauterising their wounds before an election. Here's our top 5 budget fudges that we'll be looking out for. First, they'll announce the Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, a small amount of funding for an area they've already made big cuts to. For example, the Morrison government has presided over an aged care sector urgently needing an extra $10 billion a year, according to the Royal Commission. Yet last year, Frydenberg announced a fraction of that. Even then, an aged care worker like Frances got none of it. Given the crisis in the sector is deeper than ever, expect another piecemeal announcement. Second, there'll be the re-gifting, trying to get more headlines off the same announcement. How many times do the same road projects get announced again and again? Tony Abbott announced federal funding for Adelaide's North-South corridor way back in 2013. And last month, Morrison announced, funding for Adelaide's North-South corridor. Third, they'll announce the smoke and mirrors, things that just won't happen. Remember the Emergency Relief Fund. $4.7 billion announced 2 years ago and almost none of it spent. Are the floodwaters not high enough yet? Fourth, the barrels of pork that Morrison government has made an art form of. Get ready for more funds that let them splash cash on marginal seats. Remember sports rorts or the car parks that haven't ever been built. Fifth, the too little, too late. Token announcements to cauterise issues that risk costing them seats. Take our energy transition. They've spent most of the last 9 years blocking progress, denying the effect of climate change, fighting amongst themselves, or taking credit for the heavy lifting done by states and industry. Their low emissions technology roadmap last year was so small, misdirected and overview that it's a roadmap towards staying in last place in the global race to become a clean energy superpower. Enough of their tricks though. What do workers want to see on the 29th of March? Fundamentally, it's measures that support working people to realise their potential. That is what sustainable economic growth depends on and should be all about. Let me take you through 5 of them briefly. First up, we need an end to the crisis of insecure work and cost of living. Changes to the laws to stop the many ways that employers turn secure jobs into insecure ones. A federal government prepared to argue that our national minimum wage should be a living wage and lifting pay caps in the public sector. Secondly, investing in the care economy. Provide free universal early childhood education and care and deliver fair and equal pay for those workers, nearly all women, nearly all underpaid and overworked, who educate our youngest and care for our elderly. Universal good quality childcare takes tremendous pressure off women shouldering most of the care burden. This measure alone is a tremendous boost to national productivity, an estimated $11 billion per year, because it allows those women to do more paid work if they choose. It also gives our youngest the very best possible start in life. Thirdly, invest now in good jobs to future-proof our country. Last year, we worked with the Business Council of Australia, ACF and WWF on a plan to make Australia a clean energy export superpower. With enough ambition and collaboration, we could create nearly 400,000 good jobs and $89 billion in value by 2040. We can also lower energy prices and make a safer climate. Nearly everyone is ready to play their part in delivering this if we have a federal government that will listen and act. Fourthly, rebuilding our TAFE and skills system, reverse the Morrison government legacy of severe funding cuts and neglect of TAFE and our vocational education and training system. And finally, and I can't believe we still have to say this, but we need all 55 of the Respect at Work recommendations implemented and 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave for all. But we will keep saying this and keep fighting for this until all women get the safety, respect and equity they deserve. I hope all of this has armed you for budget night in 2 weeks' time. Will it be another budget of buying votes or backing workers? I'm guessing we'll see a tired, out-of-touch government again try to reinvent itself with some big promises. But the changes that are desperately needed for a better, fairer economy and society, don't hold your breath. The good news is that the Australian public will get to have a say on what they believe and what they think is important less than 6 weeks after that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for that very thoughtful and excellent speech that gives us much food for thought. I'm actually coming, once again, my name is Greg Jericho. I work for the Centre for Future Work here at the Australia Institute. I'm actually coming today from the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people. Before we get to dig into a few things, I do want to just, because it's me, I want to post a bit of a graph that I think will go to what Michelle has been pointing out in the budget. Here are the wages predictions in the last, 8 budgets we've had since 2013-14. And you can see just a continual over-promising of wages growth to come. If the 18-19 budget, for example, was correct, wages would be at 3.5% at the moment instead of struggling to get over 2%. So it's something that I kind of want to dig into first with you, Michelle. Real wages last year took an absolute pummeling, the lowest really since ever if we discount the GST introductions. But it's not just a one-off, and this is, I think, the problem is if it was just the pandemic or some sort of quirks with the data, you'd think it's okay, but it's been an ongoing thing. How do we not only look for something or push for things in that can be done by government, but how do we change this narrative around wages wages growth always seen to be a bad thing? It was a bad thing when wages were growing at 3.5% over a decade ago. As inflation kept going down, there was the sense, this will be good for workers, and yet what ended up happening was wages growth went down all the way along with it. And when inflation is low, we're not supposed to argue for a wages growth because that's bad for the economy. When inflation is high, we should argue for wages growth because that's bad for the economy. How do we kind of go around shifting this narrative from what we see from business groups of, if you get a wages growth equal with inflation, you should almost be thankful and grateful for that?
Thanks, Greg. And look, the business community always argues that it's a good time to keep wages low. Every year, the ACTU argues with them at the Fair Work Commission to increase award wages, including the national minimum wage for the country's low paid. And their argument goes something like this. Inflation is low, growth is low, businesses aren't doing so well, so now's not the time for pay increases. Or inflation is high, businesses are saddled with extra costs, so now's not the time for pay increases. It sort of doesn't matter what's happening. It's never the time for pay increases. And they've largely got their way under the Morrison government. And that's why wage growth is on life support. A more common sense position, which is actually pretty mainstream, is that wages should at least match inflation and then, of course, increase by a fair share of any productivity improvement. And we'd add that with nearly a decade of almost no wage growth, wages need to catch up further than that to become an actual living wage. It's unbelievable in a country like Australia that we have workers living in poverty. So as well as those out of work, not able to receive enough to be able to meet the basics of life. It's true for many working people as well, hence why so many people have to work more than ever before, 2, 3 or 4 jobs, because they can't live off the one job they've got. And that's because wages are so low and because jobs are so insecure. But under this government, wages aren't even matching inflation. The real value of workers' wages has faced the biggest decline in over 2 decades. And Australia used to be considered a high wage economy, especially when it came to the minimum wage. But in the last decade, many countries have overtaken us. We're no longer near the top of the global league table, but have sunk to the average level in the OECD. So these issues are clear, and we're not getting a share in what's happening in terms of productivity. So workers are making their contribution. Labour productivity has grown by 6.1% in the last 6 years. They're modest increases, but remember that real wage growth has only grown by 0.9% over that period. So labour productivity grew 6 times more than real wages in the last 6 years. But where are the productivity gains going? Well, they're not going into workers' pockets. They're going to company balance sheets and profits. That's a key reason why company profits last year grew by 13%. So just to finish up, Greg, that's why the share of national income going to labour is now at its lowest point since record keeping began in this country.
Yeah, it's something that I think it's amazing how it's overlooked because productivity has been, perhaps for as long as I've been studying economics way back in the 1980s when I was at high school, was talk about how productivity is so crucial. It was the big thing back then. We need productivity gains. And it's amazing how the narrative has shifted. Well, why we need these productivity gains? And it's to improve our standard of living, but standard of living only improves if you actually get some benefits of that. I've been shocked in some ways how both the Governor of the Reserve Bank and the Secretary of the Treasury have both recently said wages growth should grow at inflation plus productivity growth. And if that occurs, wages aren't putting a pressure on inflation at all. And yet, if you read a number of the commentary, it is this real sense of, anything over inflation is inflationary, which is just wrong. And I think it's something that we almost have to rediscover perhaps our moxie a bit on this and take over the narrative, I think. What about, do you think there has been some research and suggestion that the role of insecure work and the real shift from full-time to part-time has played a role where for so long workers are almost struggling with the dilemma of, do I push hard for wages growth or do I just take the hours? How has that played out, and what's a solution that we can overcome that to realise that actually we are owed productivity gains in wages growth, and it shouldn't be a case of, I'll keep my wage just so I can get some more hours?
Look, I think this is the key reason why we've seen the low wage growth we've seen, Greg, that corresponding growth in insecure work is so linked to this. And when I say insecure work, the government often tries to quibble with us about the casual figures, but let's unpack it a bit. When we're talking insecure work, we're talking about casual jobs, but we're also talking about workers employed by labour hire firms who don't have job security and are often paid less than the workers that are the permanent employees working alongside. They work alongside. It's also workers now in the gig economy who aren't often even treated as workers. We've seen the shocking examples of workers who've been delivering our food during the pandemic, who, 5 of whom were killed on the roads in 2020 in Sydney alone, who are told they're not workers, but they're contractors, and that somehow they're responsible for everything to do with their own employment relationship, including things like workers' comp and safety and super. We've also got many workers who are on consecutive contracts that never end, who may have now be in their 10th, 15th year of a contract that just keeps stopping at the moment where they should be entitled to some leave and then starting again, doing exactly the same job that is clearly a permanent job, but not treated as permanent workers. And then you have a lot of workers that are increasingly employed as part-time workers, but part-time workers on minimum hours. So it's not like they are workers that say, oh, well, I only want to be able to work 3 days a week, and that's no longer the pattern. The pattern is workers, according to the employer, are given a minimum number of hours as a part-time worker, but then it's pushed up or down depending on the whim of the employer about how much work they want to give that worker that week. And all of these things combined mean that all of these workers are in a situation where they can't predict or have any certainty about how much they're going to earn day to day, week to week, month to month. So their capacity to plan for a life, plan for a good life, be able to do things as simple as sign a rental agreement, a lease, or let alone enter a mortgage, be able to take their kids on a holiday, all of these things are out of their reach because they just don't know if they're going to have a job or how much they're going to earn. So I think addressing insecure work is critical to addressing low wages, and these things can be done. We're not we can look for examples around the world as well as what we know works in Australia. So a genuine definition of casual that stops this rort of people being called casual who are actually permanent workers. There's a role for casual workers, but the number of people we call casuals now in Australia with the federal government's changes to the laws last year does not reflect genuine casual work. We can have a limit on the number of consecutive contracts that you do before you're required to be given a permanent job, a genuine right to convert from casual to permanent, treating gig workers as workers, giving them the rights that any other worker would have. These are some of the things that would make a real difference in terms of addressing insecure work.
And I think one of the things, and I'm mindful of the time, so I want to move on to one of the things that I think links in very nicely with that, with the difficulties of work and needing to be able to actually do so while raising a family, is your mention about childcare and free childcare, which I guess I'd just like to tease that out a bit more. How young are you suggesting we should be starting, and really just go to the benefits you see from that? Because to me, it seems to be one of those issues where it's both sides of the coin, that it need to be addressed and can be addressed through childcare, because it's not just helping women, mostly women, let's be honest about this, stay in work when they're having children and thus raising the participation rate. But who are most likely to be the actual workers in that sector? It's women. And how well paid are they? Generally poorly. So it's one of those issues that I think we can get a win-win on both sides, not only with participation and productivity and raising the actual production value in the economy, but we can also address sort of low-paid workers at the same time. How do you see all that working and playing out?
Look, Greg, you are so right. This is such a classic example of something that if we addressed properly in this country, it would have so many benefits. Benefits for our youngest, because what we know about children is that those first 5 years of life are the most critical time. Your brain grows more than in any, and learns more than at any other time in our whole life. So having good quality education and care delivered to our youngest will pay off forever in terms of what happens as people grow older. It's critically important in terms of women's participation, as you say. In Australia now, women's workforce participation is at 61%, and men's is at 70%. And again, that's a bigger gap. In many equivalent countries in the world, you don't see that bigger gap. And one of the reasons we see it is because of the crippling costs of early childhood education and care. Childcare has soared, the cost of it, by 39% since 2013, and by 6.5% just last year alone. And we've got one of the most expensive early childhood education and care systems in the developed world. And we spend the least on pre-primary education as a percentage of GDP. And quality of early childhood education and care is, of course, tied directly to staffing. And the workers in this sector, who are more than 90% women, are underpaid and overworked. They're predominantly in insecure work. And that's why the sector is struggling to hold on to workers. So we know that dealing with addressing the pay and conditions, and this is a microcosm of really a problem we have about undervaluing work traditionally done by women in Australia. And you can look at early childhood as a very clear example of this, but of course there are many, many others. But valuing that work properly, paying the workers properly would address the labour shortage in that sector. There's a projection that this is just going to worsen. There was already a projection that 30,000 more educators and 7,000 more early childhood teachers are needed by 2024, and making those jobs secure, paying them properly, valuing that work properly would address that. But of course, back to your point about participation, it just makes sense. If we gave the women that want to work more hours than they're currently able to do because of their responsibility in terms of caring, then it would have a massive $11 billion a year boost to our economy. So it is really short-sighted to not address having a free and accessible, good quality early childhood education and care sector. And of course, for that tantalising moment in 2020, we had it 3 months of free universal education and care for our kids, but it was given and then snatched away.
Yeah, it's very interesting what happened in 2020 when suddenly, when notionally deserving people, shall we say, became part of the unemployed, suddenly things were found to be wanting, whereas surely it should have been actually an example of what was needed. Just before, one last question before I go, so that we can go to the audience. What are you expecting in terms of the budget that, I guess, the sort of one-off little, as you were saying, the Band-Aid on the gunshot wound, I think it was, because obviously the problems with cost of living, petrol prices rising and everything, is there a concern that there is going to be a number of things that are almost let's get us to the election and aren't going to address the structural things? And how do you, I guess, address the fact of some of these things will be good, but the temporary nature of them won't be actually good? And how do you sort of combat that to ensure it's not just, they're actually doing good stuff, but to be able to highlight the problems?
Greg, I think we could pretty much bet on the fact that there'll be plenty of sweeteners, election sweeteners in this budget. I suppose, the real question is that after 9 years of being in power, are people going to believe that a short-term present or gift is really going to make a long-term difference? And what we know about low wage growth and insecure work is that it's not a short-term gift that's needed. What's needed is structural change that will mean that we have a fairer share of Australia's economy and growth going towards workers, and also that we have building a labour market that's resilient and capable of delivering what's needed for the long term. It's actually in nobody's interest to have the sort of rates of insecure work that we have. So I think, look, people are hurting. The cost of living is dramatic. The cost of petrol, I know there's working people that are making that terrible choice about, do I fill up my car or do I, pay for the groceries I need to feed my family? I was in Tasmania last week, and worker after worker was saying to me, my grocery bill, someone was saying their grocery bill in the last 6 weeks had gone up $130 a week, and it just wasn't possible for them to be able to keep doing that. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's something around the fuel excise. I wouldn't be surprised if there's something around short-term issues in terms of support for cost of living, and maybe, again, that might be in relation to tax. But what I'm going to say is that they won't fix the problem. And we've had nearly a decade now of cuts to things. Let's take TAFE and higher education. Throwing some money now at TAFE or at vocational education and training is piecemeal. There was 60,000 fewer apprentices in training in June of 21 compared to June of 2013 when the coalition came to power. I mean, we've seen funding to TAFE and VET being $8 billion lower since the coalition government was elected. Now, a short-term boost to that funding is not enough. We need long-term sustainable growth in this so that we are supporting our regions. TAFE is so critical to our regions, supporting the skill development we need to shift our economy into one that is sustainable in the long term. And I'm not, as I said, holding my breath, Greg.
I might jump in there.
Yes,
if that's
please
all
do,
right.
Abby.
Thank you so much, everyone. I can see we've got some great questions here. Michelle, the first one I wanted to ask is from Eve Stocker, and she says, if the economy is recovering so strongly, as is being stated, could you explain where all the profits are going if they're not going to increase wages for people? I'll go to you first on that, Michelle.
They're going into company profits. They're going at straight, and in fact, companies are not then reinvesting that into the economy, into capital. Like we've seen this massive, during the pandemic, increase, temporary though, of government spending, but you did not see a corresponding significant increase in corporate spending. They're not doing their lifting. In fact, most of the boost in spending came from people just spending their savings and spending what they weren't doing other things with during the pandemic. So business is grabbing those profits, not reinvesting them. You see a higher inequality. It is shocking, isn't it, that we saw during the pandemic inequality in Australia and globally rise so dramatically. And I think this is, incredibly irresponsible in relation to business, that they are not doing their bit in terms of taking what has in fact been a highly profitable period and putting that money back in to wages, but also into capital investment, also into what's needed to future-proof the economy that we have.
Greg, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, well, other than Michelle's spot on, where have the profits gone? They've gone to profits. And it's not just, some of the figures can get distorted when you throw in the mining sector, but even when you look at the non-mining sector, the past 5 years, profits have well outstripped the growth going to workers. The pandemic has skewed things a bit, but even before the pandemic, it was at sort of almost a record gap where the breakdown of income was going. And as Michelle said before in the Q&A, there's a smaller share of national income going to employees now than ever before in recorded history. The ABS started recording them in the late 1950s, and we're below that level, which is just astonishing, really.
And I think, as you said in your speech, Michelle, or maybe it was in the Q&A, that's certainly a feature of the system, as Matthias Cormann said, not a bug. The next question is from Regina Thompson. She says, investing in early childhood and early learning and care increases benefits across the board. And for every dollar invested, you get $13 back. Actually, that's a comment, not a question. I feel like Tony Jones here. I'll take that as a comment. But I did just want to ask, you did mention briefly, Michelle, that obviously we did have it for a period of 3 months. That seemed to me actually a huge shift in how we look at how important early childhood education and care is and who needs it and why we need it, to help make the economy keep trucking along. But can you just tell us a little bit more, I think, about, do you think that short period where we had it during the pandemic, do you think that's changed business attitudes to how important childcare is and to make it affordable for the economy in the long run?
A bit. I think it has, but not enough. So, I do recognise that there's a number of employer organisations that have been speaking out about the importance of improved early childhood education and care and having a fairer, more accessible system, including the BCA, Chief Executive Women and others who've recognised this. But I don't think it's widespread. And so I think having a stronger push from employers about how this is actually good for workers and good for the economy would be useful. I don't understand why it's not there, really. I mean, I think that it is one of those things that, we might disagree on a lot of things, but you would think that this is something that is just leaving the Australian economy vulnerable in a way that we don't need to be and we can afford not to be. So I really wish more in the business community would step up and take this on as an issue. And the other one on that, Ebony, that I didn't mention but is important, as well as early childhood education and care being free and accessible, is of course improved paid parental leave. Like, again, we've got a really poor system, the second worst in the OECD, and this links to women's participation in work too. So again, this is something that we should be able to deliver a better system. And if we had more paid parental leave and it was available equally to be shared between both parents, then that would change this. And we don't have to dream about this. We can look at those countries in the world that have done it and see the impact, the direct impact it has on women's participation and the more equal sharing of care responsibilities, which is in everybody's interest.
As you said, Sweden and Denmark and Finland are real places that exist where this model seems to work. I do have a couple of questions in here in and around the issue of aged care, but also age in terms of employment and older people still struggling to find work. Taking the issue of employment for older Australians to begin with, what do those numbers look like at the moment? And is there anything that needs to be done there to help encourage those people to stay in the workforce?
Well, I think absolutely we are. There's many older people that want to be able to stay in the workforce, but for multiple reasons aren't able to. Firstly, I'd say that there's issues about a lack of understanding and appreciation for the skills and experience and enormous contribution people make. We seem to be able to accept that, the age of the President of the United States of America as without a sort of a blink, and not question their capacity, but we question workers who are in their 60s, 70s and 80s capacity in Australia, and it just doesn't always add up. I'm not suggesting people should be forced to work longer. Of course, there's many reasons why people need to retire and stop work as well. But for those that can and want to, we need to provide more opportunity. And it struck me when we were having and continue to have some employers, when we were having lockdowns and when we were having our border closures, this notion that there was this huge labour shortage didn't stack up in many ways, because there were many workers, both young workers and older workers. If the jobs were safe, good quality jobs paid fairly, would be participating and willing to participate and do those jobs. The issue was not so much a labour shortage, it was a shortage of good quality, fairly paid, safe jobs. So that equation, you can't just say, we can't find the workers. Well, look at the type of job you're offering and then question whether you can find the workers.
Greg, is there anything you want to add to that in terms of, I guess, underemployment and the nature of those types of jobs and who ends up working them?
Yeah, I mean, underemployment has been a massive thing, and it's one of those things where it's also been really hard to measure of late because of the pandemic and how it's just screwed up all the figures. And so there's this suggestion that, it's getting lots better. But I wonder if it's a kind of a thing that's lurking there that is yet that will reassert itself, like a lot of these things I expect will, once hopefully we do come through the pandemic. I think going back to what both you and Michelle were sort of mentioning about, not only the childcare aspects, but the boost to JobKeeper, the boost to not JobKeeper, JobSeeker. God, all these stupid terms, these corporate speak kind of terms. To me, 2020 was just a perfect example of how well the economy actually can help out people when things go bad, and we were able to keep people out of poverty. In fact, we reduced poverty to, I think, fairly historical lows because of the increases in JobSeeker. And it was this sense of, no, this isn't just this shouldn't be a one-off thing. This should be an actual sign that we can do this. It's good for the economy. It kept people spending money. It kept businesses going. It meant that when businesses reopened, that they didn't have to rehire workforces like labourers like you normally have to do coming out of a recession. They were there. They were ready to go. And to me, it just was such a wonderful example of what can be done and how wrong perhaps we've gone about thinking about economic downturns and all these things. And yet it's been ditched, straight away. It's like, oh, we don't need lockdowns anymore, so let's get rid of all these excellent things that have worked and showed to work, and suddenly we're back in the old, if JobSeeker is too high, people won't want to work, which is truly absurd. We never seem to learn from not only our failures but also our successes. And I think some of the things, there were issues that occurred with JobKeeper and so forth, but there were some great successes that really we should be adapting and using going forward, rather than thinking, now we've got to get back to that same old mantra of all stick, we need work for the dole and all this type of guff, which was dumped straight away as soon as it wasn't going to be seen as punishing the correct people. And I just think, come on, surely as a nation we can learn from these things and realise that things like poverty are not a natural thing. They're very much a choice. And I hope, and the same with low paid in things like childcare and aged care. This is not a natural state of affairs. It is a choice, and it's not a choice that we should have to put up with. We can fight for better, I think.
Can I just jump in to agree with Greg there, Ebony? These are deliberate design choices. And the notion that we, did the cruelest thing, which is actually, double that amount of JobSeeker, house homeless people, did these things. It showed that it was possible, but then to plunge people back into poverty, plunge people back into homelessness, and not think about what the long-term consequence of that was, I think is shocking and cruel, as I said, but also, it's not in anyone's interest. It ends, even if you don't care about people, it ends up having a long-term detrimental effect in so many other ways in terms of health and other impacts on our society and community. So I mean, it is frustrating that we showed that it was possible, but my view is that basically the government was forced to act in a way that was not in keeping with what they believe. They did it for as short a period of time as possible and then turned back and, to mix my metaphors, showed their true spots.
Yeah. The last question I've got here is from Mike Sadler, and he talks about people doing it tough and the need for raising the rate of we've just been talking about on welfare, but also the need to fight for real full employment and help for people who need time to retrain. Just wondering, you've talked a little bit about TAFE and how important that is. Could you just go to that idea of people needing to retrain and how long that takes, why it's so important, and that idea of full employment?
Look, education and training and the opportunity to retrain is so important. I know this very well from the industry and sector that I spent a large part of my life working in, and saw what the impact was on those textile, clothing and footwear workers of being treated as disposable, not just their jobs being made redundant, but those people being made redundant when they had so much skill and experience and willingness to keep working and offer. But we failed miserably in terms of our recognition of that and our support for the changes that they needed help with. So I think we see that time and time again, that we should invest in making sure that people have opportunity to train and retrain throughout their working life. But the key problem of this is the privatised nature of what we've done with vocational education and training. We've basically let it be rorted. We've let dodgy private operators come into this space who don't deliver quality training, rip off people, make huge profits. It doesn't work for the people that are trying to get education and skill and an opportunity to work in other areas. And of course, it doesn't work in terms of public expenditure because it's such a rort and a waste. So I think that's why I talk about public TAFE being so critical to changing this. Also about getting those skills into our regions. Like when you think of what's happening with our economy, we know in terms of the need that clean energy exports I was talking about, if we're going to build economic change that is believable to people who are working in fossil fuel communities, then it has to be tangible. It's got to be real. The skills have got to be there and the jobs have got to be there. We can't just expect people to believe in a wing and a prayer here. So I do think that our notion of employment does need to change. It isn't good enough to think we've fixed it if unemployment has a 4 or a 3 in front of it. We need to massively increase and move to full employment, and education and training and opportunity for new and different industries and sectors with the workers with the right skill is critical to delivering that.
Yeah, thank you. A shout out to Bomaderry TAFE that trained both my dad and my brother in different auto trades back in my hometown. So important for the regions. You're absolutely right. We are going to have to wind it up there. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions, everyone. There was great questions in there on increasing union membership, tackling neoliberalism, and whether or not the government still has a strong reputation when it comes to economic management. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. This has been a special webinar episode of Follow the Money. All our webinars are free and available on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel at australiainstitute.tv. Our latest research and content is at our website, australiainstitute.org.au, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Michele O'Neil with 1 L in both Michelle and O'Neil is at Michele O'Neil AU. Greg Jericho is at Grog's Gamut, and this episode was produced by Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.